Is celebrating New Year's is haram? Yes, that is the answer you will get from the so-called scholars nowadays. No logic, no Quranic basis, just condemnation. They say Muslims can only celebrate 2 Eids. Says who? They say everything else falls under imitating non-Muslims, so it's forbidden. How did they come to this conclusion? They listed out: celebrating New Year, haram. Celebrating birthdays, haram. Mother's Day, haram. Father's Day, haram. National Day, haram. Any day outside the 2 Eids, haram. But where's the proof? They say participating in these celebrations is haram. Engaging in them is haram. Congratulating someone, even sending an email wishing them Merry Christmas is haram because are false festivals, because Muslims would not approve. But who gave them the authority to speak on behalf of all Muslims? They say imitating non-Muslims is prohibited. So New Year is prohibited. But do they prohibit cars? Non-Muslims invented cars. Do they prohibit airplanes? Non-Muslims invented airplanes. Do they prohibit electricity? Non-Muslims developed electricity. Do they prohibit computers? Non-Muslims created computers. Why are these permitted but New Year is not? What's the difference? They'll say these are technologies. New Year is a celebration. Okay, fair point. So celebrating is different from using technology. But then why do they permit celebrating Eid al-Fitr? Because the Quran mentions fasting in Ramadan. But does the Quran mention celebrating Eid al-Fitr specifically? It mentions fasting, not celebration. So if celebration isn't mentioned in the Quran for Eid, how is it suddenly mandatory? But if celebration isn't mentioned for New Year, how is it suddenly forbidden? The logic is backwards. The Quran says establish Salah. Does the Quran say establish celebration? No. The Quran says fast in Ramadan. Does the Quran say celebrate Eid al-Fitr? No. It just says fast. So where did the celebration part come from? From scholars, from tradition, from interpretation. But that same scholars say celebrating New Year is haram because it's not from the Quran. So celebration is allowed when scholars create it. But celebration is forbidden when non-Muslims do it. Who decides what counts as Islamic celebration and what counts as imitation? The scholars. And who gave them that authority? They gave it to themselves, and we are to just blindly follow them. The Quran says there is no compulsion in religion. Does that sound like you must only celebrate 2 Eids or else you're sinning? The Quran says for you is your religion, and for me is my religion. Does that sound like scholars should dictate every celebration you're allowed to have? The Quran says, judge by intentions and outcomes. So ask yourself, what's your intention on New Year? Are you worshiping something? No. Are you affirming a belief that contradicts Islam? No. Are you participating in a religious ceremony that violates Islamic principles? No. You're marking a date. You're reflecting on the year. You're making goals. That's your intention. What's the outcome? You're more mindful, more reflective, more goal-oriented. Does that contradict Islam? No. Does that align with Islamic principles of self-improvement? Yes. So where's the prohibition? Scholars say you can't celebrate New Year because non-Muslims do it. But Muslims use non-Muslim calendars every day. We use the Gregorian calendar for work, for appointments, for business. We live by it. Why is using the calendar permitted but celebrating the New Year prohibited? They'll say using it is necessary, celebrating it is not. But is celebrating your progress throughout the year not necessary? Is reflecting on your growth not important in Islam? Is goal setting not encouraged in Islamic teachings? New Year gives you that moment, one specific day to pause and reflect. How is that forbidden? Scholars say New Year celebration is haram, but the Quran never says that. What scholars do is create rules that aren't in the Quran. Then they enforce those rules as if they came from Allah. They don't. You don't want your children to grow up thinking there is no joy in Islam. Everything fun is considered haram. Music, haram. Drawing, haram. Cultural moments, haram. Right down to celebrating the New Year being haram because someone somewhere decided it was forbidden without any Quranic proof. If we were to follow the Islam of these scholars, we would just sit crossed-armed, staring at the wall all day long, because everything else is haram according to them. And a happy New Year to everyone in advance.